who will serve as the final boss of Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree DLC? The easy answer is Mesmer, who receives top billing in the marketing. He's front and center in the cover art, and the collector's edition comes with a badass statue you can pair with Malenia's. And if you're a troublemaking dad like me, then you're already thinking of ways the so-called Impaler can harass your daughter's elf on a shelf this Christmas. But neither a featured position on the box nor an incredibly detailed collectible guarantee that this forgotten child of Marika will be the final boss of the DLC. In fact, if you look back at the history of FromSoftware's games and expansions, characters who receive this much pre-release focus rarely confront us at the end of our journey. As mentioned earlier, Malenia got a statue for the base game, and though she was no doubt its most difficult boss, she was ultimately an optional one. Lady Maria was the star of the Old Hunter's marketing, but she turned out to be a powerful stepping stone on the path to the Orphan of Kos. Even Artorias the Abyss Walker, who received a DLC specifically named after him, ceded the role of last adversary to Manus. To find a final boss who received as much attention as Mesmer, you'd have to go back to the Soul of Cinder from Dark Souls 3, who made the box art and received a statue, though he was then known by the pseudonym the Red Knight. So despite Mesmer's prominence in all of this pre-release material, history tells us that he very well might not be the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree. But if not Mesmer, then who could it be? Let's take a look at some likely options, all of which will shed light on the story FromSoftware might be trying to tell with this ancient dragon-sized DLC. First up, the final boss could be the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Arguably the most important lore character we've yet to see, the Gloam-Eyed Queen was an Empyrean who wielded destined death and was defeated by Malekith at the behest of Queen Marika. She commanded the Godskin Nobles and the Godskin Apostles, Elden Ring's resident tag team champions. There are numerous theories about her, with some linking her to Melina, and others going as far as to speculate that Placidusax was her Elden Lord. I'm going to leave most of the heavy theorizing to the experts, but I would not be surprised at all if the war that took place in the Lands of Shadow, the one mentioned by Miyazaki in his interviews and by one of the characters in the trailer, was between Marika and the Gloam-Eyed Queen. There have surely been many conflicts across the generations in the lands between, and though it wouldn't be out of character for FromSoftware to focus on the lore of one we've never heard of for the DLC, the battle between these two Empyreans is certainly the most tantalizing possibility. And if that's the case, then it raises the possibility that the Gloam-Eyed Queen might return to face us at the end of our trek through the Lands of Shadow. Perhaps Mesmer was set to be her Elden Lord, explaining his embrace of all things blasphemous, most notably iconography associated with the Godskin Apostles. Still, this theory isn't without its issues. The Gloam-Eyed Queen might be Elden Ring's Velka, a lore character who's mentioned frequently, but never actually appears in the game. And if she is indeed Melina, and I certainly think there's some connection there, then it's basically impossible for her to be a part of the DLC, given that she's been burned to a crisp in many of our playthroughs. Personally, I think it's likely that we'll learn a ton more about the Gloam-Eyed Queen through the expansion, and maybe even see a statue of her, but I doubt she'll actually show up in the flesh. I'd bet on her either being Melina or dead, considering she was supposedly defeated by Malekith. Our next possible final boss is another character who we've heard plenty about, but never seen alive. Godwyn the Golden. The most beloved of Marika's children, Godwyn met his untimely end on the Night of Black Knives, dying so that Ranni could shed her physical form and the will of the Two Fingers. Even in death, his body remains, rotting away at the base of the Erdtree, and serving as a sort of distant patriarch to those who live in death. But as revealed through items found at Castle Sol, Miquella and Godwyn were close, and the nascent Empyrean was determined to find a way to bring his departed brother back to life, and he believed the eclipse might be the key to pulling off such a feat. Obviously, this didn't work, but what if the Lands of Shadow has something Miquella needs to truly resurrect Godwyn? What if this is part of why he ventured there in the first place? All of this has been speculated about by others, but the bigger question is, if Miquella and Godwyn were close, and Miquella were to successfully resurrect him, then why would Godwyn end up as the final boss of the DLC? Well, it's important to note that the Lands of Shadow were a part of the creation lore written by George R. R. Martin when Elden Ring first went into development all those years ago. And one of Martin's core beliefs as a fantasy storyteller is that if someone returns from the dead, then they should come back as a worse, more troubled person than they were before. This is why he brought Catelyn Stark back as Lady Stoneheart, as a deliberate response to Tolkien's revival of Gandalf. So perhaps, if Miquella does bring Godwyn back to life, then the results won't be quite what he expected, and he'll need us to protect him from the monster Marika's firstborn has become. But just like with the Gloam-Eyed Queen, there are issues here too. This shot from the story trailer always made me think Godwyn would be back in some way, but with the conclusion of Thea's arc and the Age of Duskborn, it does seem that the story of the first demigod to die is well and truly done, and that this open-eyed tease might have just been a nod to those who live in death. Now, with all of this focus on Miquella, what about him? Could the demigod Malenia once described as the best of them be the final boss of Shadow of the Erdtree? The trailer does begin with an ominous warning by an unknown character, terrified by the nascent Empyrean's ability to shrive clean the hearts of men. It would be pretty out of character for both FromSoftware and Martin to tease a character as being so potentially dangerous and never pull the trigger. But if Miquella is cursed to forever be a child, then how are we going to fight him? And better yet, why? Well, according to the poem FromSoftware sent along with the Shadow of the Erdtree trailer, the Lands of Shadow are where Marika first became a god. We know very little about what exactly that means, but one of Marika's key features is her dual nature as Radagon, who we fight at the end of the base game. Perhaps part of becoming a god is developing this dual nature, and by traveling to the Lands of Shadow, Miquella will be able to do just that. As we see with Radagon, he acts in opposition to Marika, trying to reforge the Elden Ring while she attempts to destroy it. Maybe Miquella guides us to the Lands of Shadow to defeat his other half, as Marika seemingly lures the Tarnished to the Erdtree to fight Radagon and end the Golden Order. Conveniently, Miquella already appears to have an alter ego, St. Trina. Could this alter ego end up being his other half, and is it possible that they could oppose us at the end of the DLC? Perhaps this shot of Miquella here isn't thanking us after removing St. Trina from him, as I'm sure Marika would do with Radagon, if she weren't, falling apart. And yet, there are plenty of counterpoints here too. The specific nature of Marika and Radagon's bond is largely unclear. Some theorize they were always the same being, separated into two bodies. Others speculate that they were once two distinct persons who then became one. All of this is to say that we really don't know much for certain other than that at one point they were separate, came together when Radagon took up the mantle of Second Elden Lord, and by the time of the game still share the same body but fucking hate each other. And I think it's quite likely that FromSoftware wants it to be that way. The DLC will no doubt answer some questions while raising new ones, but this seems like exactly the type of thing Miyazaki and company would love to keep us debating about far into the future. Having St. Trina take up a Radagon-like role as Miquella's other half and the final boss without shedding some serious rays of gold on how this Rebus-inspired fusion happened in the first place would be difficult, if not impossible. So while I'm sure we'll learn more about Miquella's alter ego in the Lands of Shadow, I doubt it will be because of an appearance as the final boss at the end of the DLC. But while this split is something FromSoftware can keep us in the dark about, there's another lore detail that, in my view, needs an answer: the identity of Miquella's shadow. From our conversations with Ranni and several item descriptions related to Malekith, we know that every Empyrean has a shadow-bound beast who serves them, but will go mad in the event they reject the path laid out for them by the Two Fingers. Ranni's shadow is Blaidd, and Marika's was Malekith. We know nothing of Miquella's, but in order for him to truly be an Empyrean, he must have had one. According to the DLC's poem, Miquella divested himself of his flesh to journey to the Lands of Shadow. This, in concept, is reminiscent to what Ranni herself did when she stole the Rune of Death. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that she too went to the Lands of Shadow, only that the core idea here sounds similar. Ranni did this to escape the will of the Two Fingers, so perhaps Miquella embedded himself into the Erdtree and orchestrated his own kidnapping at the hands of Mohg for the same purpose. And if this path, this rejection of the two fingers ultimately led to Blaidd turning on Ranni, then it stands to reason that Miquella's actions would force his own shadow, wherever they might be, to do the same. It's easy for me to imagine us defeating a boss who's powerful in their own right, like perhaps Mesmer, and feel like we're right at the precipice of helping Miquella complete his work, only to have to defend him from his shadow to close out the DLC. As I see it, this is the most intriguing final boss possibility for a number of reasons. It ties back to lore that really does need an explanation. It would give Miquella a compelling reason to come to us for aid, and it would tie back to the events of the base game by echoing the stories of Ranni and Marika. Hell, if they really wanted to turn this one into a barn burner, then they could have us fight the shadows of both Miquella and Malenia, who also should have had one according to the lore, giving us the dual boss fight for the ages many of us expected we'd get as soon as we heard about the twin demigods. Though I'm personally a big fan of this idea, I'll be the first to admit that it does have its problems. Having us fight an as of yet unnamed character who we've never seen and whose existence has only been hinted at as the final battle of what will likely be the last piece of content we'll get for Elden Ring is a bit anticlimactic. I do, however, think it's a pretty sure bet we'll find out about Miquella's shadow in the DLC. It's a big question, and the expansion is called Shadow of the Erdtree, after all. Though I think that each of these characters has a shot to be the final boss of the DLC, I could totally be reading too much into all this. When all is said and done, our closing adversary might just be Mesmer after all. He is no doubt an imposing figure, and the collection of blasphemous and heretical iconography in his character design lends one to believe that he wields the abilities of countless challenging enemies we faced during our journey across the lands between. But if I were a betting man, based on FromSoftware's history, I'd put my money on it being someone else. Thanks for watching. Big thanks to Alex Roe, who's allowed all of us YouTubers to use his incredible music for our videos. Big shout out to James Pruitt, Raven Lampkin, Corey Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Reed, and Pathonian, who get early access to my videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time.